What I'd like to do here is take a little bit of time and talk about the development of the history of systematic research within psychology. Now, I'm going to narrow in here, and because there are so many broad categories of psychology, I'm going to narrow in on child developmental psychology, because that's a fairly interesting field. And one of the first glimmers of a scientific and systematic study of children can be traced back really to the late 19th century. And this was a period in which investigators from a variety of academic backgrounds began to observe the development of their own children and to publish this data in what are known as works of baby biographies. Now, I should note here that nowadays it would be considered unethical to do experiments in your own child, although technically they didn't do experiments, they just did observations. So an early and very influential baby biographer was none other than Charles Darwin, the originator of the evolutionary theory. And what Charles Darwin did was he made daily records of the early development of his son. And Darwin's curiosity about childhood really stemmed from his theory of evolution. And quite simply, he believed that young, untrained infants share many characteristics with their non-human ancestors. And what he did is he advanced a theory that since has been discredited, that is the idea that the development of the individual child retraces the entire evolutionary history of the species, thereby illustrating the descent of man, as he called it. So, Darwin and many of his contemporaries viewed the baby biography as a means of answering questions about our evolutionary past. Now, a few decades after Darwin came Clara and William Stern, and they kept one of the most systematic diaries of the psychological development of their three children, Hilda, Gunther, and Eva, born in 1900, 1902, and 1904 respectively. And this became a major publication about the diaries of these children, and it was called Children's Talk, or Die Kindesprache in German, which became really a classic in the development of understanding children. And several decades after this, Jean Piaget, who was a famous Swiss psychologist and someone you will hear about lots in psychology, observed and recorded the development of his three children, Jacqueline, Lucien, and Laurent. And he used these observations to develop more fine-grained methods for studying the development of logical thinking in children. And his theories really revolutionized our understanding of children's cognitive development. So it isn't that these non-scientific ways of observation did not lead to knowledge, but they were simply a foundation for other ways of better, more scientific knowledge. Now, some other ways of gathering data and finding facts that we have now developed are things like self-report methods, and there are three common procedures that developmentalists will use to gather information and to test hypotheses. And these are interviews, questionnaires, including psychological tests, and the clinical method. And although these approaches are similar in that each asks participants to answer questions posed by the investigator, they differ in the extent to which the investigator treats individual participants alike. So in the interview and question method, researchers who opt for interview and question techniques ask the child or the participant or the child's parents a series of questions pertaining to such aspects as development of the child's behavior, their feelings, their beliefs or characteristics, methods of thinking, and they collect data via a questionnaire. And most psychological tests simply involve putting questions in written or electronic formats and asking participants to respond to them, whereas interviews require participants to respond orally to the investigator's queries. And if the procedure is a structured interview or structured questionnaire, all who participate in the study are asked the same questions in the same order. And the purpose of the standardized or structured format is to treat each person alike, so that the responses of different participants can be compared. Then there is the clinical method. And the clinical method is very similar to the interview technique. And here the investigator is usually interested in testing a hypothesis by presenting the research participant with a task or stimulus of some sort and then inviting a response. And after the participant responds, the investigator typically asks a second question or introduces a new task to clarify the participant's original answer. Now, although participants are often asked the same question initially, each participant's answer determines what he or she is asked next. So, the clinical method is a flexible approach that considers each participant as unique. Now, Jean Piaget, as I've already mentioned, did not only observe his own children, but he also relied extensively on the clinical method to study children's intellectual development and even a child's moral reasoning skills. And the data from Piaget's research are largely protocol records of his interactions with individual children. So, for example, here's an example of Piaget's work on the development of the moral reasoning, which shows that a young child thinks about lying in a very different way than adults do. So, he asked the question, do you know what a lie is? It's when you say what isn't true. Is 2 plus 2 equals 5 a lie? Yes, it's a lie. Why? Because it isn't right. Did the boy who said 2 plus 2 equals 5 know it wasn't right? Or did he make a mistake? He made a mistake. Then if he made a mistake, did he tell a lie or not? Yes, he told a lie. So that just shows you some ways that you can do observations and get some very different and interesting ways of gathering knowledge. There are also case studies, and in a case study, you're really interested in looking at the details of a single individual and how they function. And so it involves collecting records and cases and interviewing people and collecting information about family background and socioeconomic status and health records and academic records and work history and performances and psychological tests. And it's a very in-depth process. There's also an ethnography, and that's a form of participatory observation, often used in the field of anthropology, but also used in cultural psychology, where a person engages within a culture and they collect data about the culture while being engaged within the culture. It can often be very diverse and immersive in the ways that you go about collecting the data, but it can bring about some very rich understandings of the complexities of something like the impact of culture upon a person. Then there are psychophysiological methods. And increasingly, psychologists have turned to psychophysiological methods and techniques that measure the relationship between physiological responses and behavior to explore the biological underpinnings of things like perception, cognition, and emotional responses. And this, too, is a very interesting field where you can use what is called MRI, a magnetic resonance imaging, or a fMRI, a functional magnetic resonance imaging, or something like eye tracking or electroencephalograms. Lots of different ways of gathering information about the body's response. So, overall, I just want you to be mindful of the fact that there are lots of different ways of collecting information and data, but ultimately it comes down to what does the experimental data say? Because the experimental design is precise in how it questions the development of knowledge and will help you to delineate any issues. Just